Hello. Today we are so excited to welcome Bob Boniface. Bob graduated from HBS a year after Alex and I did. He graduated undergrad from Vanderbilt, and after Vanderbilt worked for General Motors as a finance analyst in Detroit for a few years before coming to HBS. While at HBS, Bob discovered what we like to call the Church of Search, which is the burgeoning industry of entrepreneurship through acquisition of small businesses. He partnered with a classmate that I happen to know very, very well to acquire a small business in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he's been for about the last 2 years. Bob, we are so excited to have you and so grateful for you to share a little bit about your application journey, what your business school experience was like, and what it's looked like since. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you were doing before business school, and then we'll hear how the idea of an MBA came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, I grew up in Detroit, went to Vanderbilt for college, moved back to Detroit, love the auto industry. I come from a family that has ties to the auto industry. So my dad's a car designer for General Motors. So I always wanted to do that, or join the auto industry. I didn't have the artistic ability to be able to draw cars. But when I was working at General Motors, I worked in the manufacturing finance department. So what that looks like is there's a lot of operational finance that goes on with building out the budget for plants across North America so they can build cars under budget and make sure that they are kind of running efficiently. And so on a day-to-day basis, I was working with engineers and figuring out, okay, how much does it cost to build this car? How many people do we need? Where are we going to kind of move production a couple years out? And I love the job. I thought it was super interesting. And I had always planned to stay in the auto industry long term. Obviously, we will talk later about kind of where my career ended up.
You stayed there, sort of.
Kind of, a little bit. But, I think my idea of getting an MBA kind of stemmed from working at General Motors and seeing some of the leaders that I saw around there and kind of what their path had been and kind of trying to see how I could get to their level.
I'm curious. So it sounds like you were looking at senior leaders that you admired within General Motors who had an MBA. Did you feel like you had to do that, or do you think you could have progressed to their level without it? I'm curious how General Motors thinks about the value of the MBA.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think GM historically was a very MBA centric organization. I think people say it to their detriment in a lot of cases that they're too focused on the numbers. But I think you look at a lot of the senior leadership there, Mary Barra, Mark Royce, people that make the decisions, they all have MBAs. And I think I didn't feel so much pressure to do it. I wanted to do it. I thought it'd be something that could help me get more well-rounded in my background. When I was at Vanderbilt, I was an economics major with a minors in finance and corporate strategy. So I took a lot of business type classes, a lot of accounting classes at Vanderbilt. I had a general idea of kind of what the classes would look like in an MBA, but from my time at GM, it was clear that I was weaker on certain areas that I think I could improve upon by going to get a full 2-year education in it.
That makes sense. When you were, so it sounds like even back in college, you were sort of always on the sort of business and finance track. When did it become clear it was time for you to apply for an MBA? Like, this is my moment. I'm ready to go do it.
It's a good question. The timing kind of snuck up on me. Well, maybe I'll preface this. Right out of school, I took the GMAT right after I graduated. I kind of had gotten the advice from other people that, the GMAT is very math heavy, it's very quantitative. And the more time you spend in the workplace, you might lose some of that ability to take standardized tests and you're more focused on your job and things ramp up there. So in the first couple months after school, I took the GMAT. And so then I was ready. I was like, I have like a 5-year window on this thing. Like if at some point it makes sense to apply in a given year, knowing that most people apply 4 to 5 years out of school, I could do that. When I actually applied, so I applied in the fall of 2019 to start in the class of 2022. The application process kind of snuck up on me, and I was like, well, I'd always told myself this was the year that I was going to do it, in air quotes. But I kind of looked around and said, okay, I've got some great work experience here. My stock at GM was kind of high at that point, professionally. Like I think was coming off a couple really cool projects that I'd worked on. And, from there, I was like, I think this is a really good time to apply. I've got a great boss that could help me with some of the reference letters and things like that. So, yeah.
I think that's a really good point. Like, I think some people feel I'm going to get an MBA because I'm really not happy in my current situation and I want to pivot, but it's a good point, and I did the same thing. I kind of waited. I knew that like I was going to have a really good story 1 year from now because of the projects I was working on at work. And I think it is actually a great time when you have all that awesome momentum to really craft a very strong application. So, what was kind of your narrative of why an MBA in your applications, and what you said that you wanted to get out of it to the schools?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. So like I said, my plan was to go back to GM after I did my MBA. Still could be in the future. I'm not sure, but I was working in manufacturing finance. I wanted to go to a division within the company called portfolio planning. And what that division does, these are the guys who do the most MBA like work. They work with engineers, they work with, design, finance, capital planning to kind of build the business case for cars. So they're looking 5 to 10 years into the future to say, what is the car that we're going to make? We don't know what it looks like yet, but we kind of know generally like what segment we want to target. We kind of know what the manufacturing footprint looks like and will look like, 5 to 10 years out. And we want to have a general sense for like, okay, we got to marshal all of the forces and get everyone on the same page and start planning for this. So it's a very cool department. The guy who was running it at the time when I was there was a Harvard Business School graduate as well. And so it was easy for me to kind of look at that department and say, okay, this is exactly what I want to do. It's staffed by a lot of people that have an MBA, and that's what I wrote my essay about. You talk about some of your experiences and kind of what you're expanding on your resume, but in the future, I said, okay, if I want to be a leader, I'm kind of at this inflection point where I don't really want to do finance necessarily like within the company anymore. I think that an MBA will give me kind of a perspective on all these other industries or all these other kind of verticals and fields within the company. And, from there, I want to be able to use that to get into a department that can really leverage those skills and that skill set. Yeah, that's kind of what I wrote my essay about. It was a lot about kind of the value of strong leadership. Growing up in Detroit, also, had experienced 40 to 50 years of kind of a downward slide in kind of the economic outcomes within the city. Obviously, the city went bankrupt when I was in college. I wrote about kind of the price of failed leadership. General Motors had gone bankrupt as well, and so I think being able to see how important it was to have strong leadership and was something I talked about.
What I love about that is I think it balances two things that HBS looks for on an application, which is one, I think the specificity and the clarity, like this person's going to come out of school and they're going to have a job. What you described is like, I was here, I need these skills, and then I can go here. If I'm reading that application, I'm thinking like, I'm not worried that this person's not going to find a job after school. Like this is someone who's going to be a check on the employment report. Like we've covered that base. But I think it also speaks to when you talk about sort of the role of leadership and sort of the bigger picture in Detroit, it's like, this is also someone who's thinking beyond just the job, who has these bigger aspirations of like, what do you do in your community? How does that play out? And I think HBS is always trying to balance, someone who's employable, always going to be employable, but also someone who may be a moonshot and do something really big and outsized beyond just sort of the specifics of the next job. So I think it's interesting to hear you describe and hit on both of those notes. Is that like fair to say that was in your application?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd always had the goal of like even in college where I said I want to be the CEO of General Motors someday. I want to be someone who leads a car company. And I think that probably came through in my essay. Obviously, I didn't write that, but you kind of wanted to set yourself up on a path to do that. And I think the MBA was a big part of that. And going into a division like that, I know HBS and business schools in general like those types of departments from car companies. I can think of some of my classmates who worked at Ford and were kind of in the engineering department, but they had to kind of marshal all these forces together between engineering, finance, marketing, which is exactly what you kind of have to do at top leadership levels there. So they look for people that are either coming from those departments or are looking to go into those departments after school.
Yeah, and I think you also, even though you didn't explicitly say it, I think to Julia's point of like, not only is this person very employable post business school, but HBS has incentive to have the future CEO of General Motors like come through them, like they want to be accepting the students who are going to run these really big Fortune 500 companies at some point. So I think it sounded like you're able to craft it and show a lot of potential. What other schools did you apply to?
Yeah, I only applied to 2 other schools for the first round. I applied to Michigan and I applied to Duke. So kind of, I think, different subset. I think, and the reason why I picked those two schools specifically, one of the things that I viewed as like the weakest part of my background, and if I wanted to go into portfolio planning, was like product strategy and like specifically, I had this idea that like I want to target schools that have like a really strong background in that. HBS is one of the things like I always wanted to go there. You never think it's like attainable, obviously, but with the other schools, like I was like, these are great schools that have, I think good fundamentals in those programs. And if I didn't get into any one of those schools, or if I wasn't happy with my application success in the first round, I was going to apply to a couple more schools after that.
What do you think, and this is a hard question, but what do you think, looking back, made your application stand out? Why do you think they picked you?
I think my essay was good. I think I had a really strong resume in work experience. When I was at GM in manufacturing finance, it was a time of kind of restructuring, and there was a lot in the news around GM's footprint going forward, kind of how much are they building in America versus Mexico. It was discussed by President Trump at the time was calling Mary Barra to the White House to talk about it, and there was a strike that was going on by the UAW during my interview. Our department was like thrust on the national stage, and so to be a part of that, I think was a big part of it. I had really strong letters of recommendation. I got a letter of recommendation from my director, who was my boss's boss, and then his boss, who's the chief financial officer for the whole manufacturing footprint globally for GM. And so I wrote very nice things about me. They spoke, very highly of me. So I think the combination of those two things, because I don't think it was my score, and I don't think it was my grades.
Do you happen to remember, or I feel like because of the timing of the application and what was going on and how it was literally in the news, what was your interview like? I'm sure they actually asked you some very specific questions.
Yeah, at HBS, which you guys know, the interview is very stressful. It's kind of a think on your feet type thing. One of their favorite questions always is like, if you were in the shoes of the top executive at your company, in this case, Mary Barra, what would you do differently? Or we were in the process of negotiating with the UAW, and so there were some questions around kind of well, how do you think you can end this strike, and like what do you think it's going to take to break this? And if you were the CEO, kind of what would you do differently in order to set yourself up for success for the next couple of years? A lot around that. I think they were also asking like what is your role like on a day-to-day basis now? Like are you stressed about it? Do you like doing this type of thing? And I wasn't directly involved like on the negotiating team, but I was like my colleagues were, and so I was supporting them on that. So I was able to talk to a lot of that stuff pretty well.
Just jumping around in your process a little bit, you got the GMAT out of the way, and then you said it snuck up on you a little bit, the applications. Like, did you have any rhyme or reason or process for your essay writing, or for like how you approached asking your recommenders? Any tips or tricks that you think helped structure your applications particularly well?
It's tough because I think most people that apply to these schools are very type A, and are very organized, and I think methodically through it. It snuck up on me. I kind of had this idea that I wanted to apply in the fall of 2019, and I was sitting there, and it was like the end of July, and I was like, geez, like I've got to I'm kind of doing the backwards math of when I got to start, and like I should have started yesterday, basically. I think obviously give yourself plenty of time. So I think from that, you want to give yourself a couple months to start thinking about what you're, who you're going to ask, that kind of thing. My general advice on timing is, especially if you're asking someone who's like a little more senior from you, give them some time. They're very busy. The guys that I were asking, they were doing, probably working 80 to 90-hour weeks. So I think asking them to do that was something that I wanted to give them enough time, and they were fine even with the timeline that I gave them. But I wrote my essay in parallel with what when the recommenders were doing it. But I think it's helpful maybe if you want to do the recommendations first, and then if they're going to share them with you potentially to then you write your essay afterwards. Make sure it kind of jives, because you can control what the essay says versus the recommendations.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that you prepped your recommenders. I think helps to direct them to, keep with a consistent narrative, make you look good, and have like the concrete examples to draw from, for sure. Would you say overall the biggest challenge in your application process, was it the timing? Was it thinking of your essay and going through 20 so revisions, where were the biggest challenges?
That's a good question. I think, the essay was the hardest thing for me. I think when you're filling out the applications to all the schools, there's a lot to write. You want it to sound really good. You're working full time, and it's similar to like when you're writing your college essay, where like you want to have this balance of like, aspirational versus like, this is concrete experience. And you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of what the admissions council is kind of looking like. And I think that this show, like what you guys do, is probably a great way to get prospective students in the mindset there. But, I think the essay writing was the hardest thing, especially the HBS one where it's very open-ended. And it's like, tell us something I forget the prompt. It's like, what is something what else should we know, basically? Yeah, it's like annoyingly vague, and so you could end up writing anything. So I think that was probably the hardest part for me, because the recommendations, it's like you find the right people. I didn't stress too much about that. I was like, if I think both of these recommenders will do a great job. They know me really well. I think that was something maybe where, and I know a lot of people stress over that. I remember I had my director who ended up writing one of them. We sat right next to each other. We worked really well together. He was also an HBS grad, which I was like, this is helpful. He had said, when I asked him to do it, he was like, are you sure you want me to do it? Like, I could ask the CFO at the time, who was also an HBS grad, to have her write one. I was like, she doesn't know me, like you know me, and I think that's important. But once those are in motion, you're just trying to make sure those are on the right timeline. Everything else is kind of the thing that I probably stressed about.
I could not underscore what you just said enough, which is I think sometimes people make the mistake of the recommender needs to be the most senior person you can get. It does not. It's got to be someone who can give specific, detailed examples of what you do. And certainly you can help them out by giving them a prep sheet of remember when I did this for you? And remember when I had these amazing things that I delivered? But they need to be able to go back and talk about that impact that you had in their own voice. And so I think it's wise to think about it cannot just be the most senior person. And also, quick tip, if you do have more senior people who maybe aren't going to be your recommenders, but went to the school that you're applying to, they can do an informal letter of recommendation. So they can send an email like, hey, I've worked with this person and they're great. I'm a graduate, whatever. Consider them for the program. You can do an informal one or two. I wouldn't pepper HBS with 18 of them, but you can do that as a way to have a more senior leader kind of speak up on your behalf without having to make stuff up because they haven't worked with you directly. So obviously you got in, which is exciting, and congratulations. But you got in and probably had to make a decision right as COVID was happening. So I'm curious, how did you weigh your decision of because you had the option, and most people had the option of, do I defer for a year or do I just say, let's go and see how this goes? And you obviously said, let's.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I got in, I think it was December 10th or something like that, 2020 or 2019 rather. And the time to accept the decision was in February. I remember I went to Admitted Students Weekend, and COVID was kind of in the news, and it was still something that was happening over in China at that point. But I think I made the decision, and I was like, okay, this is something I'm going to do. And I think mentally, you're at work, you've already told people that you're going to do it. You're when we got sent home for COVID, I was like, this stinks. I don't like doing this. I'm kind of locked in my office all day. I never had a kind of a hesitation. I was like, the quicker I can go to business school and get to the other side where I have the skill set, I'm the ability to make more money and have more influence at whatever job I choose. That's what I was racing toward. And, I maybe naively at the time, I thought the experience by the fall would be a lot different than what we were experiencing then. Obviously it got a little bit more prolonged than everybody hoped, but I was like, the end, the experience is one goal, but the end state for me was always the goal of an MBA. I'm not one of those people who's like, oh man, the experience and the going on the trips and stuff is going to be so impactful. It's like, I want to go there to learn what they have to provide, and then on the other side, I want to be able to reference that and do better kind of in my job.
Which is a very good perspective, and to not get dragged down in the experience that could have been. But, you still got to get the tail end of when things were starting to open up. Do you mind sharing a couple highlights of the experience?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a lot of fun. I've got a lot of great friends and, and memories from business school, despite the the first year being a little bit different. The first semester was way different, but the second semester things started to open up a little bit. We're still able to travel, and it kind of is a more smaller, intimate type experience. Going skiing with a group of 10 friends versus with 200 classmates over to the Alps or something like that. By the second year, everything was relatively straightforward and normal, and Boston was back open, kind of in full swings. I would say we probably got like 75% of the time experience was in a good, like in a normal spot. Some of the highlights, I think my second year, one of my favorite memories was because I grew up a Red Sox fan despite living in Detroit.
Boo. I'm a Yankees fan. It's fine.
The Red Sox and Yankees were playing a one game wild card game to get into the playoffs. This was in the fall of 2021, and that was at Fenway. And it was one of those things like the day of the tickets get released, and they're like $300, which is like way over the top for like a student without any income. We're like, we got to do this, and so we went there, and the game was awesome. Then we went out afterwards, and it was like a Thursday night mid class at like 8 a.m, and you're all tired the next morning. But we were on our feet the entire game, and you're with your classmates. That was it was the best sporting event I've ever been to. The Red Sox ended up winning it, but it was just a lot of fun, and so that was a highlight, I think, of the experience. Didn't have anything to do with school; it had to do with the friends, obviously.
Yeah, the people. No, I mean, those are the moments that make it really, really positive. I will note, you went in thinking, I'm going to go right back to GM, and you did not. So at what point in the 2 years did you start to think about alternatives, and tell us about where and how you landed on what you're doing now?
Yeah, I think I started thinking about it as soon as I opened the letter that I got into HBS. It's one of those things where you write about staying in your current path, but then you get into a school like that, and you're like, well, what could be? You're kind of picturing yourself as like, well, what is like the craziest, coolest thing I could do? And so I think it was as soon as I got in, I was like, well, what would my path look like if I came back to GM? What would it look like if I did something different? Because GM's always going to be there, and I can always choose to go back there probably. And so I started hearing about this entrepreneurship through acquisition thing, where, if people don't know, you raise money from a group of investors to buy a small business and then run it. So you're kind of an owner, plus you're a CEO, right out of business school. I'd heard about that kind of during my interview process, was not sure that it was something I'd be able to pursue, but I was like, that's really interesting, because I'd always had this kind of entrepreneurial thing in the back of my head, but never had the kind of the gumption probably to go out there and start something on my own. So yeah, that was something that very early on, I was like, well, if I get in, I'll look into it. And then when I did get in, like in the summer leading into business school, I started kind of doing some LinkedIn research on people that have done this, started talking to some people, in the same way that you would network with folks that you'd want to, if you wanted to work at Goldman Sachs or something like that after school, you're going to reach out to a HBS grad that, works at Goldman Sachs. We did the same thing, reaching out to people like, how do you best set yourself up to have the path through school that you could take advantage of this?
And so you went in, you had talked to some folks. The ability to network is huge. I know the classes play a big role. So tell us a little bit about, when you made the decision to pursue entrepreneurship through acquisition, and how I'm especially curious, like how HBS helped in that journey, both in like the exposure to it, but also, I'm leading question, but in the funding aspect.
So I I probably decided like on it like the spring going into the break in between first and second year, because you kind of have to pick your internship, right? And so there was nothing really speaking to me on like the corporate side. Like there was nothing that I was going to do where I'd be like, oh man, I'm super excited about going to work for consulting company or something like that, which is like a a standard internship. I decided to go work for a family friend of ours who runs an automotive forging business. It's like 200 employees. They stamp hot metal parts for cars. They make like tow hooks and things like that. Yeah, dirty, hot, sweaty business, making like no money working for him. But I was like, if I like this, if this is something that I can see myself doing, then I think this is the right path. And the internship was really interesting, and I liked the idea. I could see myself in that guy's shoes, and I was like, okay, the decisions that he's making every day, I could make, and it'd be a really cool experience to run something like this. So went back to school in the fall, kind of committed mentally that I was going to do that. The second year at HBS, you choose your classes in the elective curriculum, and so I'd already chosen to do the main search fund class, which is in the fall, with the two professors that kind of run that whole path. And then in the spring, there's two more classes that you can take that kind of expand on that fall course load. So the fall really kind of gets you thinking. They bring in all the success stories, they bring in the failures, and you're like, man, this could be me someday, and in a good way. And you have at HBS, and I think at a lot of business schools now, I wouldn't say it's just you just have to go to HBS in order to do a search fund, but you have investors that kind of hang around and try to network with students. And if you kind of raise your hand, like on LinkedIn or kind of to your classmates that you're going to want to raise a search fund, investors will find you and you can start networking and talking about that. And so the path becomes like a little bit more illuminated in the same way that if you were wanting to start a startup, you would take startup classes and you'd start networking with people that have worked at venture capital funds and things like that.
It's kind of insane to think of the investors coming and kind of hanging around and waiting for students to show interest. That's truly that wouldn't have happened if you were continuing to work at General Motors. That's truly the benefit of a place like HBS. It's pretty cool. So you actually did a call it non-traditional search fund path in terms of joining with someone else. Curious how, like, if you had certain conversations, it's almost like a co-founder type relationship. How did you know that it was the right path for you to go in with a partner instead of doing it solo?
Yeah, I think, during the fall, it's something where everyone's kind of evaluating it individually. Like you have to decide that this is something you want to do in general versus, committing to a partner and then kind of going from there. But by the time my partner and I had both been having individual conversations with investors to figure out, okay, do you want to do this? Like, who's the right fit from like an investor background to partner with for their fund? I was exchanging notes with this guy, and we were like, okay, well, are we going to do? Where are you going to search from? Like, who are you talking to investor wise? Like, what kind of businesses do you want to buy? More just like an exchanging notes thing, in the same way that you would like a cohort of people that are prepping to go work for, a consulting company. They might be doing kind of mock, cases with one another. And then eventually it became to the point where it's like, what, like there's a lot of overlap here. Like, why don't we, have you ever considered wanting to do a partner thing? I think I was the one to ask because, knowing myself, like for the same reason I didn't start my own company, like it's very hard to commit and hold yourself accountable on something like that. And I always felt like if you had someone else that 2 + 2 = 5, but it's also like, you're able to have someone who's kind of your accountability partner.
And so the punchline is that Bob ended up partnering with my husband, Tyrell. And so they did a search fund together, which is part of why we know Bob and are so lucky to get to talk to him. So Bob has to enjoy and deal with all of my husband's quirks as much as I do. But so you guys have been doing that. You searched, and I'll share, and then would love to hear sort of like now that you've been running the business for almost 2 years, how the MBA has applied. But you guys searched for about 6 months, and very quickly, that 6 months is a very short time period to then acquire a business. I know because I was just getting settled in Austin, and Tyrell came home and he's like, how do you feel about Charlotte, North Carolina? So you guys found this business, you decided to go in it together. You've been running it since January, and I'm skipping over some wild stories that you should follow up with Bob about. How has the MBA played into actually now running a company for the last 2 years?
Yeah, the journey has been pretty incredible, but I think where the MBA comes in, especially a school like HBS, where it's the case method, it teaches you to think on your feet. You're kind of like a very well-rounded athlete. In baseball, the analogy would be like a 5-tool player where you can do everything kind of well, or you've got background in basically everything, so much so that you can at least chime in with something intelligent to say or ask like a good question. In a typical day, I'll bounce from, in my role as CEO and CFO, from marketing to sales to HR to finance to operations, and that's just like in like one morning. And so if I was coming from, say, just if I went from General Motors and somehow raised money and did the same thing, I would only have maybe like one of those things. HBS doesn't teach you everything you need to know about marketing. It doesn't teach you everything you need to know about operations, but it gives you like a fundamental background so that you can take something like we had bought in the business and improve it. It was set up by people that didn't go to HBS. It had kind of organically grown into something, but there was a lot of stuff that could be improved upon. And I think coming in there with an MBA, you're able to at least understand where the opportunities are and work on some of those things. So Yeah, the MBA I think definitely helped in that regard.
It's a really good point of, setting you up as like a well-rounded generalist rather than a specialist, and how it allows you to be flexible, which it sounds like you really do need on your day-to-day job. Curious because Julia teased it. Any shocking or surprising stories that you're like, wow, this is not something that would have happened if I took the iBanking job at Goldman?
There are a lot of stories I probably shouldn't share. A lot of stuff on the personnel front is always the most interesting thing. I think that's the thing that actually business schools do the worst job at. I think because it's hard to prepare you for some of the personnel challenges. You focus a lot on theory of strategy and finance, and the interpersonal stuff, especially in a small business, it can be hard to prepare you for some of those things. So you kind of have to just rely on maybe other personal experience and how you'd manage that stuff. I do think some of the craziest stuff on the wins side, like we've been able to grow the business by bringing on new customers that the old business before we bought it probably wouldn't have a chance of doing, because it's a slightly different business model. And I think business school really prepared us well to be able to have those conversations with like senior executives at, some of these big companies that hire or that use our services, which is, it's a CDL training school. The old business probably wouldn't have been able to do that with us kind of in the driver's seat. I think understanding where those companies are coming from, having taken a negotiating class, being able to effectively negotiate against them was something that I think really paid off well for us. And I can directly point and say, okay, the MBA was worth that much in terms of revenue, which is kind of interesting.
Well, it's interesting too, and we didn't mention that the business that you guys acquired was a CDL business, so commercial driver's license, truck driver training business. And we talked about how, the HBS brand is so helpful with investors. But correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the HBS brand is probably not something that plays into your day-to-day with your team all that much, right? Like, tell me what that looks like. In some ways, I would assume it's something that you might keep your cards sort of tucked away a little bit on that, because it's not something I'll let you fill in the blanks, but like, am I on the right track? How does that play in your day to day?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we didn't really use the HBS thing when we were buying the business, because I think in a lot of cases, like the businesses we were looking to buy, it was kind of a turn off rather than something they were explicitly looking for. When we came into the business in order to build credibility with our employees, because we're young guys, they're like, okay, who are these young guys who just bought the business? Like, why should we trust them? We mentioned it to the employees, but it's not something like where it's the ultimate trump card. Like, you have to listen to me because I went to Harvard Business School. Like, that wouldn't work. Our employees care about like our ability to make decisions. They care about our ability to make sure that they have a job security and that we're leading the business in a way that allows the business to grow and succeed. And if because we went to Harvard Business School, that is something that helps, then great. Harvard Business School is the best place on earth. But it's more so like, are we making the right decisions? Do they feel like they can come to us with like challenges? Do they feel confident in our ability to lead and that our vision is the right thing for the company? And so it really comes down to, a track record. And are we able to show, not tell, but like show that we're the right people to lead the company?
My brother-in-law is in a similar situation, and it's really showing that you care, but then can make the decisions that are for the greater good. Curious, moving beyond the search fund experience, in terms of where do you see yourself 10, 15, 20 years? How do you see yourself progressing? Like, you mentioned that potentially still going back to be the CEO of General Motors. Curious where you see yourself going now that you're in the midst of this entrepreneurship through acquisition experience.
Yeah, it's hard for me to say, like, because I think we're still very much in the early chapters of the story of our business and our journey. I think that, eventually I'd love to get back to the auto industry. That doesn't necessarily have to be at an OEM, like at one of the big companies. That could be in a multitude of different ways. The way that I view our initial success with Search Fund and to the extent that we have a great outcome with our current business, I view that as like the safety net and security. I think throughout my career in life so far, I've wanted to give myself kind of a floor of kind of outcomes, and I think HBS is a big part of that. Where it's like, okay, once you go to HBS, your earning potential floor has been raised. I think a lot of people kind of talk about an MBA that way. The same way, like if we have a great outcome with our current business, you've got financial security. You also have kind of the opportunity security where you haven't led a business, and so you could always use that to run something else. I think at a certain point where it's like if I wanted to choose where I want to go, I'd love to do something that's related to cars in the auto industry. And like Julie said, ours is kind of like that right now, but it's definitely a different beast. So I don't know what that looks like. I'm not one of those people that says like, well, I have to stick around the search fund ecosystem forever. It's something that I'll end up knowing really well, but it is also one of those things like once you work for yourself, I think it'd probably be pretty hard to go back and have a boss again.
Well, and maybe just to wrap us up here, it's been so interesting to hear about your experience. And I've heard Bob talk on two HBS admission panels before, and every time I hear him talk, I hear something new and different and interesting. But reflecting back on your experience, whether it's the application process, the decision to go to the MBA, or actually how you used your time at HBS, do you have any parting words of wisdom or advice for potential students?
It's always hard for me to give advice because I think everyone's MBA experience is so different. Like the reason why someone pursues an MBA is different. What the right time is for them, because you have people who are maybe doing their mid-30s, people who are doing it right out of college. I think with anything in life, it's just kind of keeping your antenna up and keeping your ears open for different opportunities. I think the MBA is a great opportunity for a lot of people who are kind of in the early part of their career to learn about a lot of different paths. They're like you're giving yourself like the opportunity to learn about different ways that your life could unfold in a way that if you're working in a job in investment banking or marketing or something like that, and you choose not to do an MBA, you're more likely than not going to end up kind of in a path that's similar to that if you're kind of a white collar professional. But if you go to business school, you don't know what your life's going to look like, and it could be something that's really interesting and fun. And you're exposed to a lot of people that like that. So just keep your antenna open and kind of be open to the possibility of new paths.
Well, I think that is the perfect way to end it. Thank you so much, Bob. We learned a lot from you today and really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Bob.
Been fun. Thank you.
All right. Well, we feel so lucky to have been able to interview Bob. In terms of what makes him stand out as a candidate, I think one, he has a really great brand. GM on his resume, Fortune 500 company, a company that's been run, whether or not good or bad, by MBAs for a very long time. And so it's a company that really values MBAs and sends people to get MBAs on a yearly basis. And so business schools love repetition and pattern recognition. So that really helps him stand up. I think the team that he was on, he was doing really cool things. He was working very cross-functionally on big projects and projects that were hot topics in the news. Business schools love when candidates can speak to real-time current events, have a point of view on it. So I think that was really attractive as well. He mentioned he was applying when his stock was highest at GM. He was coming off really great projects. And I think people tend to apply when they are frustrated or bored with their current job. And so it's almost like your stock is at its lowest, but it can be really great to apply when you have a lot of momentum and a lot of great talking points to give your recommenders. And yeah, I think he also had a good narrative in terms of he'd gotten exposure to these different teams, but saw that he wanted to be on a very specific team within GM and that an MBA could help fill out his strengths profile. And so he was super employable when business schools are looking at him like this guy absolutely can get a job right out of school. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about his application process and what he did well there?
Absolutely. As you said, I think he had the right ingredients going in, but it's all about your approach and how you bake the cake. And so for Bob, I think his ability, one, anytime I see that someone took the GMAT during college, I just want to give them a round of applause because getting it done early and then not having to worry about it on top of everything else is just a surefire way to help your focus as you go into sort of the essays and other pieces of the application. I also really liked his approach. We recommend this all the time of if you're unsure if an MBA is right for you or where to go, look at the leaders that you look up to and see what they did. And as Alex pointed out, a lot of the leaders he looked up to and career paths he could see himself going down had gone to HBS and similar schools. And so that's a surefire way to think through and see, this could be a really good path to get to where I want. Finally, I think the other piece that Bob did an excellent job of is he gave plenty of time to prep his recommenders. Nothing makes me more anxious than when I see someone who's getting ready to apply and they're giving their recommenders less than a month. It's just a crapshoot. And I think making sure you give them the materials so that they can be successful making you look successful is just such an underrated, easy thing to do. Do it early. So for me, all those reasons meant that Bob's background and then his approach were top notch. When I hear what he got out of it, it was so fun to hear from Bob because I've gotten to watch his path to search and entrepreneurship through acquisition. He came to business school thinking he might go back to GM and do sort of a leadership rotation, but the exposure to the different classes, getting to see different investment methodologies and vehicles like Search Fund enabled him to jump right in. And those classes are fantastic because every class you have a different group of searchers, successful and not, come in and speak about their experience. And so he got a number of reps hearing about exactly what it was like and could make an informed decision that was what was right for him. What did you hear that he took away from the experience?
Yeah, just to build a little on the search fund piece. I mean, if he had stayed at GM, he was just not going to be in a position where investors are coming to him wanting to give him money. Like that is something that is so specific about top business schools, especially HBS and Stanford. It's just an opportunity that is really hard if to get otherwise. So yes, just reiterating, that's a huge piece. I think also very quickly realizing as soon as he got in, like, wait, HBS is this amazing insurance policy. Like, I can always go back to GM, but let me just like take advantage of all these opportunities that are coming my way. He also mentioned thinking on his feet was something that he felt the case method was really helpful for. And in the search fund world, it is a lot of thinking on your feet, and you don't always have all the information you need. There's not one right answer, but you've just got to go with your gut and keep plugging ahead. So I think he got a lot out of it and is now a successful search fund entrepreneur. Excited to see what else he does. So overall, feel really grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with Bob. So thank you, Bob. We really appreciate it. And I think a lot of people will find value in this interview.